Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm pleased to be here for our annual plan pre-adoption check-in workshop. At this afternoon session, what we're seeking to do is work through from no to do, so that questions that we are asking you is whether there are any adjustments that should be made to the draft annual plan to prepare for the upcoming rates capping environment, whether any adjustments should be made to the draft annual plan to respond to pressures from the current fuel supply issue, and whether there's any other information that you would like or need to enable a decision about adoption on the 27th of May. So as we work from no to do, for you to know the pros and cons of adjusting the annual plan budget, to see how a change could be made, the implications of a change, and in do to tell us whether you have an appetite to make a change. So we're going to start with looking ahead to the rates capping environment, and I'll pass to Alison to speak to that. Thanks.
Right. Kia ora koutou. So you will recall when we had our session with Morrison Lowe recently, that there was some concern about councils who start off at the rates capping journey with already having made all of the savings, that they'll actually be on the back foot compared to other councils that haven't gone through that journey. So under the rates capping environment, we talked about that capital becomes increasingly constrained. So because what doesn't change is your revenue, which means that actually that then constrains your debt, because your debt is actually a formula based on the revenue that you're collecting in. The LGFA lending is tied to covenants, and that's also based on that council revenue. And so basically it's really constraining the amount of debt that we can take out, right? So rates capping means that you're also constraining your balance sheet. So on a $60 million income base, you could only raise an additional $5 million worth of debt annually. We are raising more than that. I think next year's in the plan it's around 13 or 14 million. I'll need to check that precisely, but it is more than that 5 million just to get the business of council done in a regular year. And those interest rates on that new debt would be 7% more. So each time you walk into a rates capping environment, you're actually constrained straight off the bat based on what you did the year before.
Just before we keep going through the presentation slides, Alison, I'm just reminding council this is a public conversation.
Yes.
The rates capping, we're not in a position where we can confirm final advice for council on the terms of rates capping. So just apologies. And just a reminder that we're not in a position where we have completed any final advice or published any final any findings for council or community around rates capping, but what the team are just drawing on is some of the very high level takeaways when we think about what the world might look like in a rates capping environment. But it's important that we don't delve into the detail based on what is some early assumptions and early advice that we've provided to council at public excluded workshops.
Where's the clicker? Sorry, thank you. So noting that, so anytime you increase the investment in assets, that means that you're raising that fixed cost base, and that means that your depreciation expense is also increasing. And it starts to make up that larger share of costs. So the interest, the depreciation, all these things become a base cost that you need to navigate within a rates cap comes into play in future. So it matters obviously because these are things that are outside of the control of council, so I can't dial up Treasury and say, I'd like this interest rate this week, please. It's just not possible. You've all seen how things fluctuate dramatically when things happen on the other side of the world and how that impacts us. So there's a lot of volatility in these costs moving forward, and they're difficult to reduce or restructure. In terms of rates capping takeaways, so you have to control your debt if you're going to have a rates cap. So the revenue gets capped, but your interest and your debt doesn't. So you need to be very deliberate in terms of what you are taking on. So that likely leads to less investment in infrastructure over time. And the financial benefits of growth cannot be overstated. So growth is incredibly important in a rates capping environment. So if you can drum up more growth than is in your long-term plan estimates now, the better off council will be. Again, some of that's out of our control. We can make things as attractive as possible, but these are market forces, things that we don't have our direct control over. So cost pressures fluctuate, but the revenue doesn't. And any decisions that you make has a long-term impact for financial sustainability. So the rates decision you make in May will have an impact on what that means for years 3, 4 and beyond. So if you get the base of your rates in a favourable position, it will just give you some more time in which to make that investment and make sure that you're investing in things that are going to give long-term benefit. So you also have to be very strategic in what you're choosing to invest in. So there was a figure there around 1% equaling 5.6 million. So that was if you raised your rates by 560,000 in year 1, over the life of a long-term plan being 10 years, you're looking at receiving $5.6 million more just by the decision that was made in that first year. So getting it right up front is something that's really important. So this, in terms of rates choices and what they mean, so at the moment you have rates flexibility. So you've been through a process, you've determined you wanted to put savings in comparison to the third year of the long-term plan. But in terms of your strategy settings, there is that ability to move up to the 10.1% increase in year 3 of your long-term plan, being the annual plan for 26-27. At the moment, it's sitting at 5.8%, and you've seen some indicative rates numbers around that. We haven't modelled specifically any changes beyond that and what it means at the individual layer of properties, but you'll recall through the papers that you saw back in February that a 5.8% increase for some properties actually meant more like a 13% increase, but for some actually meant a decrease, because coupled with the challenges of setting a rates increase, you've also had a district valuation change. So your rating valuations have changed, which means that some people's properties have decreased in value, others may seem stable, so that piece of the pie that they're paying towards has changed. So for some people, the changes will be more significant already than the 5.8%, but equally there's others where they are gaining compared to what they paid last year. So as I said, we haven't modelled that, but if we looked at it from a perspective of just the rates revenue that we collect in overall growing, so for each percent, so it's actually quite hard to see this, but for each percent rates increase, you're basically adding on that other $560,000, right? So if you go out to the 10, or around about the 10, you're looking around sort of 2 million in additional revenue coming through the door. And of course, additional revenue strengthens that balanced budget metric. and it supports the depreciation funding and or reduces debt. So there is a bit of a trade-off in terms of which one you go for there. So that's in terms of the rates capping environment potential.
And I wondered whether you wanted to pause there and discuss that in light of rates capping, or we could continue with the fuel supply and then pause for a discussion after that.
Thank you. I just wondered, we don't have any indication as to the percentage of households within our area that have increased, as you were talking to in terms of a large increase in potential rates payment, as opposed to those who have been devalued in property.
Great question, Councillor. I think we had some.
Yeah, so councillors will recall Councillor Olsen leading up to the annual plan conversations asked for some analysis on that, and so we provided an Excel sheet on kind of top 100, bottom 100. I would have to quickly find that to maybe if the conversation continues, and I'll just refresh my memory on that work.
Shall we continue with the fuel supply and then come back?
102 rural properties receiving a rates increase of 15% or more, which is largely driven by the revaluation. Reminding councillors that for the last 2 consecutive annual plans, because we have largely kept the general rate down or gone backwards, rural's not been impacted in the way our urban ratepayers have been impacted, which is where the big increases have fallen because of water investment.
Look, in terms of fuel, it's a difficult one to quantify what the impacts may be long term, because we don't know. We're doing a whole lot of work now with our contractors to try and understand, obviously, what the impacts are and level of service trade-offs. Over the last month, we've seen diesel price come back considerably, but not to the level it was 1 April. So while we had modelled some exposure in the vicinity of $500,000 based on when diesel was nearly $4 a litre, it has come back, so that would have changed. The impact's likely to occur in some of our bigger contracts, and Dan may be able to add to this when we go through the indices and the contract negotiation as part of the process. And we're still, even today, still having conversations with our Green by Nature around trade-offs of levels of service to try and understand their impacts and what it means for us.
Yes, in terms of signalling, there's an early impact, particularly from some of the smaller contractors, the plumbers, the builders, that will adjust hourly rates accordingly. There's mechanisms within a range of contracts, some to have escalations of fuel, but others rely on either quarterly or annual adjustments, which are off a price index, which may or may not pick up the big spike that we've seen in recent times. So some of that will be picked up potentially after the end of financial year, as we look to extend contracts potentially in the recycling space in particular. There may be some discussions around assumptions that have been built into long-term plan for savings that will have to be adjusted. So it is a matter of watching what happens with the fuel price, and we'll continue to monitor and engage with our contractors. So some of them we're awaiting responses in writing, and we'll need to keep a close eye on the quarterly review that's coming up in a number of those contracts.
Just, I guess within a lot of those contracts, is there a mechanism for them to charge like a FAF or whatever when we're doing them?
Short answer is some do. Green by Nature have a specific clause to that they can around fuel, or for example is fuel, but others probably not so prescriptive. And I think we did hear the message loud and clear when we had the conversation with council around looking at what the contract is and not not effectively being too easy on our contractors as well in terms of leniency.
So with that, we'd like to open it up for your feedback on what you've heard and any questions. So, Monique?
Yeah, so maybe just to frame that conversation, you prior to Christmas approved 5.8. We we did the work early, and we're now in a position where you've got a little bit more information. We're on track to bring a report to you at the 27th of May council meeting for you to consider the adoption of the annual plan. If you have a view that we should adjust our advice, when I say adjust our advice, adjust the budget settings from 5.8 to now accommodate some of the pressure around fuel, or to take into account some of that early advice you've had around rates capping, we need that guidance from council today so that a council report can adequately accommodate those options. So this is not a decision making day. This is really, we're trying to get a steer from council around, is there an appetite to consider an increase from 5.8, and if so, what does the shape of that advice need to look like, or what information you might need.
So I wasn't sure. I was waiting for Mayor Bernie to tell me I could speak. No. I certainly have an appetite to do a little bit of work, understanding that everything comes at a cost of officer time, because I don't believe these higher fuel costs are going to go away in a quarter. So I think that that's something, unfortunately, our new reality, we might have to adjust our budgets. So I think there might need to be a little bit of work there. I certainly think we do have to plan for possibly a year of higher costs, and it may never go back down. So, well, that could be our new reality.
Similar, I'd just like to get a really clear idea around, if we were to provision for that increased fuel cost, what impact that would have in terms of sustaining our annual operation spend, because I think we're already operating in a constrained environment. Any additional fuel cost increases are going to put pressure on operational lines, which means that stuff just can't get done because we're making adjustments. So I think it would be prudent to make a pragmatic decision up front that this is the expected cost. If fuel costs go down, great, we'll have some savings at the end of the year, but I think if we don't plan for it now, we should consider it.
Sorry. Just from my point of view, obviously, definitely, I suppose that sort of 500 grand cost increase for fuel, I think. So for what I'd like to see is probably maybe a scenario where we look at a 1% increase from the 5.8 being 560,000, and then maybe what other implications there are around that, whether it's 1 or 1.5. But I'd like to see some examples just so we can see over the 10-year period what it looks like, but also obviously just that short term. And to Noel's point, we don't know when the fuel thing's going to cease as such. So, looking at some of our contractors and subcontractors to an extent, and the question was, even if it's not built in there, we need those subcontractors and contractors to fulfil their contracts. So we have to be upfront, and if it's not necessarily, even if it's not in there, we need to be upfront footing that, I think, because obviously we want them there long term too.
Yeah, look, from my point of view, it'd be a disservice not to at least consider an increase. I think we need to be aware, and the public needs to be aware, that 5.8, there's no fat in the system. When we worked through those envelopes and got to the 5.8, we really did cut things to the bone, including the internal organisational cuts that were made.
So moving forward and acknowledging, as Alison has pointed out, rates capping, that the general threat to our financial sustainability under the rates capping scenario is absolutely real. It is absolutely real. Add to that the unforeseen, and we've talked about the fuel crisis. We can also talk about the weather events. But what else? What are these other unexpected things that will happen to council where the public, the community we serve, will rightly want council to step up and perform? And to do that, we have to have the resources in which to do that. For me, it's a case of absolutely seriously looking at an increase, being very clear as to the reasons, and Paul has talked about, how we can contextualise that in terms of the fuel crisis and maybe let that drive the increase. But for me, it's about acknowledging the real hurt in the community in terms of those fixed costs that they have every day, and that's why we took the knife to so many things, because we recognise that our council represents a very poor community, but that a council that goes broke, a council which can't deliver those things, which if it does not deliver, will not happen, is not an option either. So for me, it's about identifying, and through further work, what the reasons are that drive the increases. And I think we just have to be bold now, because we'll regret it if we don't. And if I may briefly delve into the past, the COVID era, where council decided that because of the pressures on the community at that stage, they would not give us 0% rates announcement. Instead, it was minus 1.8%. And the years and years we spent catching up on that decision. So that's weighing in my mind too.
Just from my perspective, and building on from that sentiment, is there a way in which, or a mechanism within the way that we rate people, that we could actually have like a FAF type system or a line item or something, so that would then give the community assurances that it's just based on this fuel alone, so that once the fuel situation settles, that goes, or how much flexibility do we have in that space? I'm just trying to build the process.
You can do that, absolutely, Councillor Gray. So you could make a decision for holding it only for that period of time. That is then a decision to only deal with the fuel crisis and won't have any impact in terms of the rates capping mechanism. But yes, you could make that decision.
I think, though, just to clarify, that for that to be a specific rate, this is where you're going to potentially roll your eyes at me, Councillor Gray, requires an amendment to our revenue and financing policy, which triggers significance, which triggers consultation, and you don't have time for that. So yes, we can internally treat it as a specific fund that is ring-fenced, and council could make a deliberate decision, but in terms of the actual rates notice that goes to council that says fuel crisis rate, no. Not with the time available.
I'll take that as a no and a yes.
It's a yes, it can be done, but you'll be telling it in words rather than in your rates notice.
Yep, that's all right though. We could let the public know, because I just think it builds assurance that we're not just sneaking an extra cost to people. Like this is for a specific thing, which I think most people could understand.
An example of where you've done that where it's not a specific rate but it is ring fenced, is the adverse events fund. So there is, I don't know what we call it that, I'll call it the weather event fund. So there is 100k in a budget every year that gets put aside, and we know that it's ring fenced for that. But that's not a particular rating line in a rates notice.
Just so we're clear, because I don't know if Councillor Gray was suggesting this, but if you wanted a flat rate across all ratepayers, that's also not possible, right? Because of we're up against our 30% revenue from targeted rates, and so even if we wanted to, we couldn't have a flat, say, $30 charge over every ratepayer for fuel-related costs. that would be the fairest and most sensible thing. But because of the constraints we have in terms of the rating system, that doesn't appear to be possible, right?
It's a very good point, Councillor Jennings, and that rates cap will become even harder once the waters leave. So there will be some pretty detailed rates conversations to be had through your long-term planning.
I remain comfortably uncomfortable about the 5.8% increase. We did a huge amount of work around that. And unlike many of our contractors, we can't put a surcharge on fees and charges and things like that to claw back the costs that sit there for us in relation to this fuel price increase. So I'm comfortable with a piece of work being done that gives us an indication of the impact on our business that might necessitate a small increase in that 5.8% target to ensure that the organisation isn't adversely affected any more than it currently is with the pressures. So yeah, I'm comfortably uncomfortable with where we're at, but okay to look at what the impact of the fuel price increase is and how we could accommodate that in our annual plan.
Yeah, I'm I'm kind of on under Joe Mason's, your Councillor Joe Mason's comments there, because I feel really uncomfortable and comfortable, like a rock in a hard place in terms of the realities that we have of the council, but equally the realities of our community and the financial stress and concerns that they are under. And having met with different community groups just in this last week, the reality of our centre, of our town, and those beyond is grim. It is really difficult for our community out there. I mean, we are now the highest in terms of domestic violence. We also are extremely high in terms of our drug use within the whole country. And these, I'd really like to see those kind of concerns come into our conversation about what this actually means if we do increase that to our community, and how does that reflect in our growth going forward with our residents across the board. Because at one stage, on one hand, I completely understand where we're coming from and the need to secure and our position as a council, but then on the other hand, understanding that the reality is that people just cannot afford it, and many are at the absolute bottom, and this is going to tip a lot of people over the edge. So I would support seeing different types of increase models, so that we're not just left with one and this, but there is that range in between that we can have a look at and what those consequences actually are, and that would make me feel a little bit more comfortable.
Happy to support the modelling. Do want to express that the concern I have at the moment is that even a 1% increase disproportionately affects a small number of ratepayers because of the way it then applies to the general rate. And these are exactly the ratepayers who are probably already significantly impacted by the fuel issue themselves, because we're talking about rural properties, primarily people who are using diesel and machinery and equipment, and so there's already a pressure on them in terms of their businesses. And so, looking at that spreadsheet that you sent back in January, rural properties are facing sort of about 11% in real terms increase, and so adding on that additional 1%, it isn't just an extra 1%. It's as you said, sort of it's a 2 or 3%, and so we're really starting to put significant pressure on one group of ratepayers. My question would be: is there? I know that we're pretty much hard up against that 30% in terms of the targeted rates, but is there any scope to see what a model looks like where we further adjust those targeted rates as much as we possibly can to kind of smooth over what that 1% modelling looks like. Because the rationale for that is that everyone's then kind of more fairly carrying the cost of that increased cost, and it's not just being lumped onto one group.
Yeah, if I could perhaps just comment on that from a very naive perspective, so being quite fresh to council, my view has been very early on in the rating system that the penalised people appear to be people that are living in small homes within the urban centres, and so I can see that the 11% increase, but I think there's a couple of things at play there. So I understand that you moved to a capital value rating perspective, a mechanism on your roading and your stormwater. The other thing is that potentially those properties are the ones that have had the increase in capital value rather than a decrease. So there's a few things that I'd like to unpack in order to understand, are our rural communities actually paying more than they should in that general pie? Because if it is a rural business, let's not forget when we charge rates, there's a 15% GST that they get to claim back on. They also get an income tax benefit. These are all things that your retiree living in a small unit in the Vin does not have access to, so immediately they're paying 15% more. So I haven't got the answer for you, Councillor Jennings, but I would like to understand a bit more about those increases, because I suspect some of it is by virtue of how the rating system has been built over time, that it looks like a big jump in this year, but potentially there's more at play there.
And I think that that's an example of the very in-depth conversations that are going to happen during the long-term plan. And had we not been in this situation where it's like, oh, new information on fuel, new information on rates capping, should we stop and pause and just have a think about whether the 5.8 should change? This conversation is really just checking with elected members before you go and adopt the annual plan at 5.8. Do you want some extra advice that considers what could a 6.8 look like, for example? I think what we're hearing is people are up for the advice, and ultimately that's the point of the 27th of May council meeting, is the decision, whatever that decision is. What we can't do in that advice, though, is try to do a whole rates review or a piece of work that looks at amending our revenue and financing policy to try and get away from some of the unintended consequences of that, because we just don't have, we don't have the time, but B, council have already made the decision we are not consulting, and to consult now would mean that we would breach our statutory requirements around rates, striking of rates.
I'm up, I suppose, for the conversation, definitely, but I must admit I'm erring on the side of trying our utmost to leave it as it is, for a number of reasons. And I'm more worried about 1 July 2027, to be honest, because that is going to mean our ratepayers are going to be paying a separate water bill, as well as a council rates bill. And my thinking is that's going to be quite a shock to people. That combined, it will be a significant increase. I just cannot see that being the same as what we're charging them now. And the other thing that worries me a lot is the lack of detail about rates capping and what it's going to do and how we're going to implement it. By 1 July 27, we'll have obviously a better idea in terms of that. I suppose what I'm looking for in that modelling, though, is where is that $563,000 going to be spent? Because if it's for to make sure that we continue to deliver core services, then yes, I'm much more in support of it than I would be, to be honest, to cover fuel costs.
because I think that's a short-term measure that we're just going to have to live with in some respects. But if it's to continue to ensure that our community get the core services that they expect, then yes, because I don't want us to push the pain further down the road, to be honest, because we've done this, and as David said, the 1.3% it was because we borrowed money to fund depreciation. We put off all those sorts of things that we should be doing, which we've corrected, but it's taken us 5 years, and all of a sudden now we're sort of almost not going to be able to do that, and that really worries me, that we're just pushing the pain down the road. So, it's a real balancing act for me in terms of how we, it sounds great, 10 years, $5.63 million, but we know the realities of trying to operate in the system, that things change so quickly, and I just worry about that 1 July 2027 date.
Yeah, so, and look, ultimately, this will be your decision, Council, not ours. If Council was to hypothetically consider an increase to 6.8 from 5.8, that 560k could be tagged towards the funding of the additional cost of fuel to deliver core services, remembering that there is a little bit of a contradiction there, because what direction we've had from Council is that you've got an appetite for us to cut levels of service temporarily in order to manage the fiscal challenges. And I think this conversation is just testing with Council, do you really mean that? Because it's going to need to be more than what we just presented to you in the last few weeks. If the impact continues, it's going to be more than just a potential change to recycling and a potential change to mowing sim parks. We also, Council could then say, well, whatever's not spent of that 560k could be put towards early repayment of debt, or be put towards increasing your funding of depreciation, which, reminding Council, we are still not fully funding, and we're obviously on a pathway to get there ASAP. The other option, the option is you stick to the 5.8, you continue giving the organisation that mandate around, we'll just manage it, and we're prepared to bear the consequences of that inside the community in terms of what levels of service might need to be impacted because of that, because as Deputy Mayor Allen has articulated, there is no fat in the system for us to just suck this up. I suppose the thing that I want to foreshadow, though, is that if the fuel price does not drop, and so when we talk about 1 July 27, what you might think, if you're operating within your 2 to 4%, and we're already coming to you with fuels cost us $500,000 more, and we can't cut that out of the budget, there is 1% of your 2 to 4% already. And are you prepared to face the consequences that comes with that, around that then requiring further review into how the Future Fit roadmap actually looks back in the rear vision mirror to say, okay, the fuel thing hasn't changed, even though it might. We don't know, right? This is what's so challenging is the environment around us. We're just not quite sure. So whatever way you look at it, there will be opportunities and consequences. It's ultimately a decision for governance. And we just want to ensure that A, you've been provided the opportunity to have the conversation, and B, that when it comes to that decision, you've got the right information and advice in front of you without overcooking it and us doing a whole lot of work that is unnecessary, or also is the work that you'd more see in a long-term plan process.
This is just kind of a little bit outside the conversation just for a smidgen, but the really red flag that's waving to me in terms of the unpredictability of our environment and the fragility of our global world economy, whatever, at the moment is that we really should be looking at that idea of an alternative income stream to supplement what is happening in the community and in our world, because this is not going to go away and things are going to continue to become more difficult. And I just want to flag that that's something that should be in our minds as councillors moving forward, is how can we take that complete dependency off our ratepayers and start looking at possible other alternatives so that we're in a better position.
So, I'm hearing we understand we're going to have to make a decision. We need yes, we'd like some advice in that council paper, but I'm also kind of getting the sense of that advice, like we just need to balance that advice and how much work we put into that advice, given the kind of what I'm interpreting as kind of a conservative, some conservative feedback from the council table.
Can I just clarify? Because the thing that I'm happy to see the modelling and don't spend too much time if not. But what I care about, what I'm concerned about, is how the extra 1% would be split among ratepayers. Like, is it all just dumped on the general rate, or is there an adjustment that across some of the targeted rates as well? So it's the how is that I'm probably more interested in.
And I guess that's where a lot of the work will come from, because there are a lot of nuances and things that we may not already be aware of, as you brought up, in between the differences between that urban and rural, so that we're really clear about the realities and the consequences of that discussion.
Yeah, we'll have to do some work about that, Councillor Jennings. Like, what I'm thinking is that because we know at a high level what services it impacts, that if we put an allocation against those services, so solid waste, parks and property, roading, then it wouldn't necessarily all get clumped into the general rate.
That's great if we've got some.
But some of our more, let's say, defined targeted rates, like aquatics and community and library centre, is not where we're saying the pressure is. So I just want to manage expectations, and that you might still see a large portion of it fall into the general rate. But I think what you're looking for is transparency about the logic that drives that. And I'm sure Alison will do some work on that.
Monique, is it correct to assume, though, that most of the extra fuel costs are in roading, parks and property, and what was the other one I was thinking of? Solid waste. Can the rating for those, can they not be apportioned for the rates, for the fuel costs in that space?
Yeah, that's what I think I just tried to say. Yeah, so yes. Okay, well, we'll prepare the council agenda on that basis. I think what we'll just have to work through is we'll be looking for you to still adopt the annual plan document, but it might be that depending on your decision, depends on what delegations you give to the chief executive to go away and make those changes, that will be reported back to the council meeting when you strike the rates. It's like everyone's comfortable with that?
And just making sure that, I'm just a little concerned that council is going to get a report a week before they go to a council meeting to make a decision. Is there any opportunity that we could have maybe an informal sort of conversation around some of that sort of before the report's written, maybe? Or I'm just worried that councils may not, with only a few days to mull over what they've got in front of them.
So we obviously had today's conversation. I think what we could commit to is by the end of next week, having something very high level to council via email that is following on from our workshop. Here's what we're shaping up. Here's what the thinking is. And depending on how our development of the report is going, it might be that workshop, that week of the 20th of May, we might see whether we can pop in just an annual plan check-in. But yeah, really hesitant to spend a whole lot of time on this if it's not the thing that council are keen for, and so I'm hearing important but light touch. And that's what you'll see reflected in the report. Thank you, council.